A very warm welcome to you. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24 tonight. And with Sri Lanka aiming to repay debt in 3 years, here we are at Hyde Park talking about Sri Lanka's potential for growth, sustainable development and the transformative journey that Sri Lanka should and would undertake during the next few years, aiming at mid to long-term development and growth here in our country. I've invited to our studios a distinguished academic and practitioner, Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja. A very warm welcome to you and Ayubowan. Former Director of Research at the ADB Institute, which is based in Tokyo, and presently visiting fellow at ODI Global of the United Kingdom, which is the largest think tank based on economics and development in the UK. The author of 15 books. You were offered the doctorate of in economics at the University of Oxford and the first degree from the London School of Economics. I have a large profile that our research team was able to dig up. I know you're not in favor of talking about all your accomplishments, but I have your latest book as well, Sri Lanka, From Debt Default to Transformative Growth. I intend discussing all this, but let's talk first, Dr. Wignaraja, about Sri Lanka here in this global setting when there's Trump taking decisions that affect all of us, the global supply chain to the global economy, and wars in Gaza, in Ukraine, and how all this, the global situation really impacts trade, investment, and the economic climate.
Thank you, Indeewari. It's a great pleasure to be back on your show again after some time. The world economy is in a turbulent, uncertain time, at least in 2025 and possibly in 2026. Global growth will most likely be less than the 3.3% the IMF predicts in its latest forecast, which was done in January this year, before Mr. Trump assumed office. And there have been these great regional divergences seen in the World Bank projections and the IMF projections. The IMF, for instance, talks about China slowing to some 4.7 or 8% a year. It talks about India growing at 6.5%, the US growing at a shade under 3%. And the causes of all of this are what people call the polycrisis, which is essentially a series of related shocks which have come together, and the sum of those shocks is greater than the whole. And we have the Russia-Ukraine crisis, we have the COVID pandemic, we have the Gaza issue, we have fragmentation of supply chains, and we now have this new phenomenon of Mr. Trump with his policy of raising tariffs on countries which he considers to have a trade surplus with the United States. So all of this is quite a complex mixture, and there is people who are talking about the world economy going back to the 1930s with some risk of a recession that may come.
And now we're talking about Sri Lanka. You've also published this book, a book that you co-edited, Sri Lanka From Debt Default to Transformative Growth, where a number of solutions I see that you've given out. This book suggests that Sri Lanka should introduce, implement, and undertake these development goals, proposals that you've suggested, undertake pragmatic economic transformation, support fiscal sustainability, make growth inclusive, make the central bank's independence work, ensure external and domestic debt sustainability, build a cross-party consensus on the economic direction of Sri Lanka. Let's first talk about the book. There are a number of articles and writings of some accomplished individuals such as yourself, all included in this book.
So the book essentially was the attempt of ODI Global, which is the UK's largest think tank, to provide some ideas for an incoming government in Sri Lanka in 2024. And we prepared this book between May and September last year, and we got a set of leading experts, including the central bank governor, and also Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy, the former governor, Greg Smith, the lead economist at the World Bank, Ravi Aryasinghe, who is now the director of LKI, but also former foreign secretary. So eminent Sri Lankans and international people to provide essays. And we culled from this 27 key proposals on how Sri Lanka should go from debt default to transformative growth. And the key message really is we should build on the stabilization by enacting a series of reforms. And the reforms really include things like opening the economy more to foreign trade and investment through free trade agreements with India in particular. Also, this importance of trying to cut red tape and digitize the economy, which is happening now under the present administration. Finding ways to get overseas Sri Lankans, people of Sri Lankan origin, to invest in Sri Lanka, because foreigners aren't investing per se in Sri Lanka. So this is another source. We talked a lot about infrastructure connectivity and how that can be very important, providing we invest in projects which are high yielding rather than low return projects, which we might have done in the past. And then we talked a bit about education and training, which was very important. And then the last important issue, to make all this inclusive by suggesting that SMEs should become an important extra leg in the Sri Lankan economy, particularly those in the rural sector, and that we should attempt to move people out of poverty using anti-poverty programs with better targeting and ensure food security for the population by reducing the post-harvest losses that have been there. And that's a way to actually bring down food prices, which are critical. So there was a whole set of things that came out of this very useful set of essays from various colleagues.
From the worst economic crisis in 2022 to date, Sri Lanka has taken a number of measures, enacted legislation to really bring the economy back to a stable path. Do you think these measures pave the way going forward for a sustainable and long-lasting development?
So we had the start of this after the default, if you remember, and one should get the history right. It was, after all, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa back in 2022 who decided that the homegrown solution prescription that he'd been given by his then advisors, including the Treasury Secretary, this former central bank governor, and the President's economic advisor, were incorrect and led to the default. And then he shifted to going to the International Monetary Fund. And with that came a number of important things. The first is a program which built a set of new laws. There was the Central Bank Act to make the central bank independent. There was also the Public Finance Management Act, which put better discipline to our public finances. And there was the Debt Management Act. So those were three important things that came with the IMF program. And then the newly appointed central bank governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, played a very important role in trying to get out inflation from the system. He raised interest rates significantly to deal with this inflationary spiral of 70%, which was critical. And then, we've had Indian aid that came to help the economy as well. And finally, we have had a consensus with President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was there, who continued these policies. And also the current president, AKD, also gets credit for continuing this consensus that we need to move through a better macroeconomic policy for Sri Lanka to move forward. But that's not the end of the story. There is much more to be done.
What, in your view, is the outlook for Sri Lanka this year?
So the outlook for this year in Sri Lanka is 5% growth, according to what the central bank say. Inflation is now actually in deflation, meaning price rate growth is falling, according to the numbers. But poverty remains very stubbornly high. Some 50% of Sri Lankans are said to be deprived by the UNDP's multidimensional poverty index. The World Bank estimates something like a quarter of our population is poor at the level of $3.65 a day. And there's massive out-migration. So these are huge challenges.
Has poverty been significantly impacted since the crisis, and have the numbers increased?
So the problem with this is that the household surveys are expensive and only come out infrequently. So what people do is they try to look at samples of population to tell you a story. And the story appears to be that the poverty numbers have remained stubbornly high at somewhere between 25% of the Sri Lankan population to 50%, some big number like that. And there may have been a little bit of trending downwards with growth recovering in the Sri Lankan economy, but there are pockets of poverty. I mean, one big issue is old age poverty, for instance. We are an aging population in Sri Lanka, and more than half our population will be over 60 years old very, very soon. And so this group are very poor, particularly women who are vulnerable, and they have an issue because we don't have proper pension system. Our welfare support services and agencies don't adequately cover people. There are health issues. And then there is this sad issue for me of child malnutrition. And that we know because we have 100% coverage of every child born in this country, and we have their birth weight. And there appears to be some stunting there. So we have some acute problems. And the sad part is we don't really have the resources to deal with all of this without proper growth. So we're going to have to think of a growth plan for Sri Lanka at the next phase of our development, now that we've stabilized. And that growth plan has to be led by better macroeconomic management and an export or perish mentality for us to move forward, and a strong emphasis on the private sector delivering that story while maintaining pathway for the poor and the MSMEs and so on to come into the mainstream of development.
And when you say shifting Sri Lanka's growth trajectory from debt crisis to economic development, what kind of industries are we looking at here? What do you suggest? What do all our scholars who've written essays on this book recommend?
So the first industry that's doing very well at the moment is tourism. We may hit the 3 million mark this year. And that's the highest we've ever had. If you're lucky, we've had 1.5 million tourists a year, right? So that's the quickest one, because at least 60% of the establishments for the tourism sector are informal ones. Small restaurants, small hotels, tourism operators of different types. It may be the drivers of vehicles and others, right? So there's a lot of informality in tourism here. And if this grows very fast, there will be a big trickle-down effect on income. And we have to improve this by branding Sri Lanka better. I think we are doing disservice to our tourism brand. We're branding it as kind of a sun and sea destination, where really we have much more. We have wildlife parks, we have historic tourism, we have a multicultural tourism center in the north, which is completely underexploited. And we need to link small and medium enterprises to this tourism benefit. So it's not just the larger firms that can also benefit. So we need to do tourism. Agriculture is, I think, another important area that we have underinvested in, particularly adding value to our agriculture, right? And then there is also an issue of state land. There's too much state land which is unproductively lying there. And we need to think of a land bank to sort of ensure that this state land is released for business purposes. And then we have sectors like the ICT business professional services that I think can also come up. And I think we need to provide the opportunities for that group to come in. And we may also have niche manufacturing if we play our cards right. We may have some high value added garments that can be there. And then we need to look for things like auto parts, which might be there, and things like boat building. So we have a range of things in our economy, and we have to unleash the potential away from the tea, tourism, textile kind of economy. And that structural shift will be critical for us to drive our next stage of growth if we want to go beyond this middle income status, as people have talked about, and beyond debt.
What, in your analysis, is the investment climate here in Sri Lanka? We've been talking about political instability, the debt situation, and then the requirement of a stable government, stable policies, consistency. The recent government has been talking about amendments to the Economic Transformation Act as well. So how does this really translate into investor confidence on Sri Lanka?
So since the pandemic, we've had a roller coaster of political and economic cycles in Sri Lanka. It's been up and down, and that really mostly has been man-made, unfortunately, through these homegrown solutions, coupled with the effects of the pandemic and these different shocks, such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict that have come. Now, the good thing about last year's election and the election of President Anukumara Dissanayake is really that we have political stability. He had a decent majority in Parliament, in fact a 2/3 majority, and he can enact the legislation he needs, right? And the other very good thing is he has been very pragmatic, far from the campaign trail where he talked and there was a lot of discussion about socialist policies. We have a very pragmatic program as seen in the budget which has just come out and being discussed. And that budget is very important. I mean, the macroeconomic stability is kind of ensured to some extent by the Central Bank Act, the Public Management and also Debt Management Act. Those three bills are critical to give us the discipline we need to keep the macroeconomy in a good state. And then he's talking a lot about digitization of the economy, and that's critical to speed up the service delivery of public sector services, as well as targeting the poor properly, and also delivering a much better digitized currency, for instance, in the Sri Lankan economy and things of that type. So it's a very ambitious project that can be there, while at the same time ensuring there's more expenditure on health and education, right? So those bits are certainly good things that have been done. Where I think we need to be bolder really is on the exporting FDI nexus. So we really need an export or perish mentality. And you know, they talk a bit about you know, reform of the BOI and the Export Development Board. That's a little slow coming. I think we need to be very clear. I think, to be honest, the BOI doesn't necessarily have to manage industrial estates. It can be pure promotion of investors coming in. And rather than just going after the big projects, be they large Indian investors or Chinese or others, of which very little is coming, by the way, we can do a lot more on bringing the overseas people of Sri Lankan origin here, which are typically small investors, and also bringing in a lot of small and medium investors of foreign origin who are already in places like Ahangama and investing in the tourist economy, who are doing small restaurants. I think we should be targeting a different group. Because the environment is so risky and people are still a little bit suspicious of state policy, but also of other things, in spite of, you know, the good things we do, and I think we do it by example. And then we really must also deal with opening up the labor market. Dubai and Singapore are the best examples of this, because we've had nearly 1 million people leaving the country in the last 3 years, right? 300,000 last year and the years before. And we need to plug in the skill gaps. I mean, we have big holes in our labor endowment. And then the last thing I think is terribly important is we need to create Moroto University as a massive center of STEM education, science, engineering, mathematics. And I would disproportionately allocate education budget resources for that, because we have to go into the tech space and into engineering if we want to have high value added manufacturing, high value added agriculture and value added services. And we just don't have the numbers to do this at the moment. And of course, English has to be very widely used as a language of instruction as well as understanding, while not neglecting local languages. And people can learn 3 languages. I don't think that's a big issue, honestly, in a country like this.
Education is where you suggest we begin. There's much talk about the budget being a continuation of policies of the previous government, or although the campaign pledges of President Anukumara Dissanayake during campaigning was to either amend the IMF agreement, to not continue certain pledges to the IMF, and also amend certain legislatures that were enacted. But again, now the opposition suggests that this budget would really run down on the government coffers to impacting growth trajectory for the country. How would you look at that?
I don't think that's quite true, to be honest. I think you know, the president deserves credit for being very pragmatic in what he has done, which is a continuity of policy broadly of Gotabaya Rajapaksa once he abandoned the homegrown solutions and went to the IMF, of Ranil Wickremesinghe, who helped bring around the turnaround during his time, but didn't reap the political dividend from that. And you know, you have this in the budget with really these 3 important pieces of legislation that are very much still in process, and one encourages government to keep those pieces of legislation in place, because you know, the Indian example is the best case of this. You know, they went to the IMF many years ago and they have never gone since. And that's a very good example. So we must use the IMF program as a way of building prudent macroeconomic stability as doing this. The second thing, of course, is the digitization, which I think is terribly important. You know, we really have to cut the inefficiency across public services and public service delivery, and also the corruption incentives by digitization. And I think that's very important. I mean, it takes a long time to set up a business in Sri Lanka. I think the president in his speech talked about 82 days and numbers of this kind, which is horrendous when it comes to setting up a foreign invest project in this country. And we have to really cut through this type of red tape and the lethargy, you know, and there's resistance because there are people who benefit from the system as is, right? And so, and then this very important story of trying to look at the anti-corruption stuff. I think that's very, very important. If we want investors to invest here, both local and foreign. So there's red tape and there's corruption. And we have to get rid of that. But at the same time, we have to look at the technology and skills side of being able to upgrade this economy. So there are big challenges ahead. And in the other bit that they've done, I mean, they have ensured in this budget more spend on health and education and also on welfare, right? So he has done a sort of a difficult compromise, and he's got the IMF to agree a bit more on the social spend. And he's luckily last year we did quite well on the fiscal side. So he's had some headroom to be able to do a bit more on the social spend stuff, right? But next year, I think we're going to face a more unfavorable external climate with possibly a trade war, which maybe they're more globalized. So the exporting thing will be much harder. We're going to face a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, particularly with China, US type of issues there. And we're going to be facing a much bigger impact of the outmigration of Sri Lankans versus the aging population which will kick in. So we need to think of those issues in the growth story as we think about going forward.
Among the 27 proposals, I go back to the book that you've co-authored of many scholars who've contributed. There is a proposal to make the central bank's independence work. Could you elaborate on this? We've been talking about central bank independence and that the central bank has got its own sort of autonomy, independence within the system that we work now. What more do you think needs to be done?
So what happened under the Central Bank Act is we adopted something called a flexible inflation targeting regime, where the central bank really looked at price stability as the main thing that it did. Right. While also making sure that the financial system was also in a good, stable place. We didn't have a banking crisis that followed the debt crisis, and that's what sometimes happens in countries like Argentina and other places that have had this type of crisis. And for that, one thing that was done was to remove the requirement of the fiscal deficit basically being financed by money printing by the central bank. That was one thing. And the Treasury Secretary was taken off the board of the central bank, the governing board, right? And some independent experts were brought in, and the central bank governor, though, was also accountable, because if the inflation target was not met, he had to provide a written statement to the finance minister as to why the target was not met. Yeah, so there was some accountability in this. I find a little bit confusing at the moment. You've got a monetary board and a governing board, and I think that's a little confusing in my view. I think you should have one powerful board that looks at both aspects, but the governor should be given more independence and more autonomy of management of the central bank. I find with the governing board, of which I'm not a member, so I'm just talking as an outsider, I think we should delegate the running of the central bank to the governor and his team, and then hold them accountable for the results. Yeah? But monetary policy and ensuring price stability and financial stability should be really the job of the monetary board. So that's one kind of an issue. The other thing I think which is terribly important is that the personality of the governor becomes very important in such a structure. Right? We're very lucky to have Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, who in my book has really been a patriot and a national hero in bringing the country back from the brink, very much through his untiring efforts, along with the political leadership that has been there. And I think so the identity of the central bank governor becomes a very important issue in any future scenario. And it has to be somebody, I think, from within the central bank. Very hard for anyone from outside to come and become a central bank governor, and I think that becomes an important issue. And then I think we also have to look very importantly at building the capacity of the central bank to do things like early warning systems. So one of the big issues for me during the crisis was you had the then central bank governor who said no IMF, we are absolutely fine. And then the day we defaulted on our foreign debt preemptively, we only had $25 million in the central bank, right? Which is less than 1 hour of imports. And if Indian aid had not come in, the country would have starved. And that's the honest truth of it, right? Now that situation must never arise again for the prosperity and benefit of all Sri Lankans. So we need to have early warning systems which show the national security number, economic security number, should be the reserve level of the country. Because we're a very heavily economically dependent country on imports, right? And so we need to ensure that we have 3 months of imports as a stable indicator so we can import food to feed our population. And that is the situation we found ourselves in the default. We couldn't pay our debts, we couldn't import, and we couldn't buy food. And I think that's a terrible situation. So early warning systems becomes very important, and those should be public. In every citizen's mind, they should know what our foreign reserves are.
Right. Before we go in for a quick break, I'd like to ask you, the book once again, Sri Lanka's Transformative Journey from Debt Default to Growth. There are suggestions for interventions for Sri Lanka's growth, and there are similarities and examples drawn from the situation in Greece. How do you think Sri Lanka can learn from what happened in Greece, and what significant measures should we take right now in a very brief note? So
the Greek financial crisis was probably at the heart of a broader crisis in southern Europe. And it was really an analysis of mismanagement through many years, and high welfareism, a lack of emphasis on exporting and being competitive. People liked long holidays. What's happened since then, and there was a huge bailout from not only the International Monetary Fund, but also the European Central Bank. So that was a big coordinated effort. So one lesson for us is, the importance of getting a program right to get you out of a crisis, a growth kind of oriented program, and ensuring macro stability as a key part of that, as a leg. A second one is to have donor coordination. We have lots of donors here, some working at cross purposes, and really the government and the external Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Ministry of Finance should get a handle on donor activity and being able to coordinate that and manage it. And it goes back to having a growth plan and then getting different people to fund it properly, so that you can actually make sure that it's all used properly. And the very last important thing is people have to work harder. So in Greece, they cut the number of holidays. They got people to go much more on performance-related pay. So productivity becomes really critical if you want to come out of the crisis. And in Sri Lanka, we enjoy an inordinate amount of holidays. I mean, I'm technically retired in some level, and I love it being here. But it's terrible from a productivity point of view. I mean, we should have something like 11 or 12 public holidays, plus maybe 5 or 6 religious holidays. I think we enjoy far more than that in Sri Lanka.
Well, it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We are in conversation with Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, former Director of Research at the ADB Institute in Tokyo, and presently Distinguished Fellow at ODI Global of the United Kingdom, the largest think tank on economic development based in the United Kingdom. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We are in conversation with Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, who is also the author of 15 books, especially on regional integration, development, and Sri Lanka's growth. Dr. Ganeshan, I think we've spoken about Sri Lanka's economy, and we don't have much time here on the program. But let's look at our external partners from donors to trade partners. Sri Lanka's president, who in his first visit overseas travelled to India, a number of agreements were pledged, and we are looking at development with our closest neighbour India, who came into Sri Lanka's aid during the crisis with a credit line and also with support for stabilizing Sri Lanka's economy even before Sri Lanka went to the IMF. And there is China, Sri Lanka's long-standing development partner. With all this, we're talking about Trump, trade wars, and how whether Trump is going to position India and support India as a major superpower in the region and also affect China's presence in the region. How do you think a country as Sri Lanka, with such strategic location, geopolitical importance, is going to manage all this given the internal crisis and with our own problems that we have?
So you've asked me the easy question. The management of foreign policy over the years has been this neutral foreign policy. And we have tried to balance great powers off, more or less, since independence, except in short periods where we've had a sort of a pro-China stance in our policy. Right? Now, I think in this new era of 2025 and beyond, we're going to have to think much more carefully, and we've got to really rediscover our geography. Okay? And by that, I mean we've got to learn that Sri Lanka is in South Asia, and therefore the India-Sri Lanka relationship becomes absolutely critical. And as you rightly said, during the crisis, India came to our aid, and they provided us with $3-point-something billion of funding, without which Sri Lanka would have starved. And that's as basic as it gets, before the IMF program kicked in 11 months later. Right? Now, with that comes a price, unfortunately. We mismanaged our economy and we had to go outside, and there comes a price. But it need not be a price that Sri Lanka is then subservient to India in some sense. Right? So this is where the visit of Anurukumara Dissanayake to Delhi was very significant. Okay? He got a chance to rebuild the relationship, reset it in some way. And I think there are at least 4 things we should be thinking about doing as we consider resetting that relationship. The first is Sri Lanka has to look to a very important economic relationship with the 5 South Indian states. Okay? And that's about business to business ties between the different chambers in those South Indian states and the Sri Lankan chambers and the Sri Lankan business. Right? So that's the first thing we've got to think about. The second thing we've got to think about is this question of sort of connectivity, and I think the 2 proposals that are really important is things around our energy security, because during the crisis we had no petrol, and remember I came here to this interview in your van, and you just about had enough diesel because you had generators and so on, right? So that tells us about the 3-mile petrol queues and the 3 days waiting for petrol, right? So we need to think about an oil pipeline between India and Sri Lanka where we can get oil, because they get it at a cheap price globally, also from Russia, and we can get the oil. Now that doesn't stop us getting oil by ship from anywhere else in the world, Saudi or wherever it might be, but it gives us an additional line. And then we need to think about an energy transmission line to India, with renewables being very important in Sri Lanka, with Indian and other investment, and we have linked to the Indian grid. So the energy link is terribly important, right? And that's, I believe, an important issue. And again, we can get gas if there's an LNG terminal that is set up from anywhere in the world. So we're not dependent on one source, but we shore up our energy security. The third very important thing I think we've got to think about is New Delhi and Colombo piloting a sort of a regional production-linked incentive scheme to encourage Indian investors to come to Sri Lanka to invest. Right? So the Indian government has this Make in India program where it encourages investors within India to go off and make in more distant provinces in India. Right? I think they should extend that to Sri Lanka with Sri Lankan support in some way and provide fiscal incentives for Indian investors to invest, for instance, in the auto parts industry in Sri Lanka, and certainly in food processing. And I think we could benefit from those types of linkages, right, if Indian investment were to come in. And then the last thing I think is we really have to rather rapidly sign a trade deal with India. That's been pending for some time. And I'm not quite sure where that is at the moment, even though the joint statement between the Prime Minister of India and the Sri Lankan President said the trade deal was very much at their forefront. And we need to think very strategically on setting up a trade office, which was there under the Economic Transformational Bill, and I think that function has now moved to the Ministry of Trade. We have to sort of get our skates moving on setting up a negotiating team and starting that discussion. So I think with a four-pronged approach, India-Sri Lanka as a bilateral relationship economically can actually be a model for South Asian cooperation along the lines of, say, Thailand, with the greater Mekong sub-region that involves Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and that's formed a very nice block. And we can be a model if we do this well. And on our side, we have to sort of look at our tariff policy a little bit to make sure that some sectors which have a lot of SMEs and our poverty issues, we protect. We also have an anti-dumping law, which is very strong. And most importantly, we raise the competitiveness of our industry so we can actually export to India, invest in India, send our workers to work in India. I think this will be a very important engine of growth. On China, which I think is a very important issue, and you touched upon that, we need to sort of look at how we use Chinese funding and expertise much more prudently. I mean, you know, my reading of our infrastructure investments that we had was that, you know, the Chinese were very generous in saying to us that you tell us where you want the projects and you put them. And we put them in southern Sri Lanka in Hambantota on the guise that the traffic flows would come from China. Now, China has not invested here. They have given us loans at 6% often in places where we wanted it, but they have not invested. Now, that tells you something about how they see us. And during the crisis, they did not come with the same kind of money that India came with to bail us out, right? So we need to think very strategically on how we manage that relationship to our advantage.
I think you mentioned previously when we met 3 years ago too that any assistance from India too comes with a price, but to look at greater market access and increased investments here in the country from India or vice versa. You speak about regional integration, how air connectivity to trade connectivity would benefit the region, but what really is the potential now? Is it a common currency? Or is it trade links or a trade pact? Because we've seen how South Asia really decades after decades have had challenges as a region.
Yes, so South Asia is the least integrated region amongst all the regions in Asia. Interregional trade is very small, the supply chain does not function properly, and there are lots of non-tariff measures in this region. So this is a big problem. And part of it is the Indian issue of a little bit of suspicion around its neighborhood while wanting to build better relationships with the West against China, right? And then part of the neighbors being very suspicious of India. So I think the India-Sri Lanka relationship can transcend that. And in any way, you know, Sri Lanka, whether we like it or not, the United States is reaching out to India in a big way. And the Trump-Modi summit in mid-February was a very good example of that. And that, by the way, is a very interesting way of thinking about how we approach our relationship with the United States. Because, you know, we enjoy a trade surplus with the United States of about $2 billion. And if we are discovered, we could well have tariffs on our garments, for instance, and on other products. And so the Indian relationship was they lowered tariffs on some critical American imports. The Harley-Davidson was a very good example of that, which they lowered, and also on certain farm machinery and so on, before Mr. Modi went to meet Mr. Trump. Second, they talk about a trade deal on tariffs. Right. And then also India will buy American weaponry and also allow other important dimensions of it. And so that's already being worked out. And so we need to also use, if such tariffs were to come on Sri Lanka, we need to use opening up to American imports and other imports, which is inevitably what will come, to really boost our industrial competitiveness, to expose our economy to competition and to draw in, say, American companies to come and invest here, right? So we need to be very focused on how this external threat, if you like, may be there from the United States raising tariffs and the generalized picture by linking to India, which is obvious to me, very obvious. In troubled times, you go to your geography. And by the way, the United Kingdom, which did Brexit some time ago, is now desperately almost trying to forge a defense relationship with Europe and a trade deal of some kind so that, you know, United States worry about tariffs coming on Europe, for instance, and the actual effect doesn't affect Britain so much. And Europe is going to have to stand on its own, particularly in the Ukraine conflict context. And we need to think also strategically ourselves. So regionalism is inevitable in our region, and India, Sri Lanka, because of the AKD Modi conversations, can be a model for the rest of South Asia. And Bangladesh is going to be difficult with the Indian context, because Bangladesh has decided to go pro-China, which I think is a mistake for Bangladesh in the long run, in my view. But Sri Lanka, I hope, just doesn't make that mistake.
You've spoken about how Sri Lanka can go from aid to trade with India. How can we really implement this and look at more trade relations and do away from development aid to other policy development that are extended from major superpowers to major countries? This is also at a time when we've been talking about the USAID revelations, and how this kind of development aid, as suggested or brought out by many, saying that this kind of aid really shifts policies, has supported regime changes in the country. We're not going to talk about the legitimacy of these claims or controversies, but you speak a lot about how to transform aid to trade. How do we look at this? This is also where, after we spoke about RCEP, BRICS integrating with larger blocks of the region.
So we need to have really a growth plan for Sri Lanka. I think this is essential, right? And in my sort of thinking about this, I think the president should appoint an independent growth commission on Sri Lanka, right? Made out of the foremost experts to look at the constraints to growth and give him clear recommendations. And then I think the prime minister should convene a growth conference to get agreement across the political parties on what that growth plan should look like, right? And this is really beyond the IMF program, which expires in 2027, and how is it that this country can get on with its sustainability of its economic prosperity while paying the debt off, right? And in that program, there really should be the consensus on 3 or 4 things. One is macroeconomic stability, which is critical. No more homegrown solution nonsense, no more talking about inward orientation. I think that time is now gone. Okay? And for a small country of 22 million people, this is just not going to be possible, right? We have to think much more focused on South Asia as a critical element, and India becomes big. Because, you know, if we miss the opportunity of India, which is growing at 6.5% and expects to be a developed country by in 20 odd years, this will be really leaving the rest of Sri Lanka very poor for a long, long time to come. Now that doesn't mean we do that, you know, in a situation where we're an aid-dependent country to India or anyone else. We need to think of our competitiveness. The second bit of that is how we create a small open economy in this environment, and we would be nimble, and we can draw lessons from Dubai, we can draw lessons from Singapore and others on how we keep our openness while encouraging the domestic sector to progress. I don't think these are alternatives. These can be done in a very phased manner. And using, you know, the engine of diaspora, of Sri Lankan origin investors from the Sinhala and Tamil communities in many places, as well as a small, more risk-taking foreign investors to come here, as well as empowering Sri Lankans and creating all the skills. So Moroto University, with a massive emphasis on STEM education, I think would be a very good bet. And then to have this very important issue of being able to change policy if we have any problems that go forward. So this kind of growth plan needs to be flexible as well in the future. So I think Sri Lanka faces a stark choice. This is the bottom line. Either we may grow and do well, and by 2028 we'll be in a good position with 5% plus growth every year, or we face the problem in 2028 of the 18th IMF program, with much more hardship on the Sri Lankan people and much more austerity, and sadly that will have social consequences and possibly political consequences. We saw the dramatic pictures in 2022. You were reporting during that time where Sri Lanka, you know, chased away a president, to say very simply. And you know, people in Sri Lanka are very impatient about the delivery of public policy for economic well-being of the people. And I think that is the spectrum of the future, and I think the choice is very stark, at least in my mind.
You gave us two possibilities here. If we are to focus on the second now, to avoid such a situation. I know you've given us a number of recommendations throughout this discussion, but if you put it simply, what key decisions should the government take right now?
So I think we need to think of a proper reform program for growth. And that's the bit I don't quite get yet from what there is. And that involves really creating a proper export economy which leverages tourism but builds that next tier. Government talks about $30 billion worth of exports coming by 2030. What is the pathway? That's what I'd like to know.
I have about 2 minutes on the show, and I'd like to dedicate that to talking about alleviation of poverty. You mentioned about the situation in Sri Lanka and how grave it is. We are also talking about taxes, how government revenue should be improved, but this also affects the everyday, the professionals to those middle income category. And what do we do about the low income families to those below the poverty line? Do you think we have a sufficiently spread social safety net, or do you think this should move away, that we should move away from handouts and look at a way to spur economic growth within and ensure that everyone is involved in economic activity?
So there's a sort of a problem, right? And you know, the fiscal side has two issues to it. One is expenditure, and the other is the tax issue. On the expenditure side, I think there is still a set of questions around the scale of government expenditure. We have a very large public sector in this country, 2 million odd workers, if we take all elements of it. And we have a large number of state institutions that are not working very well. If you just take the state-owned enterprises, for instance, there is Sri Lankan Airlines. Government is, I think they said 20 billion rupees or something.
And 10 to pay interest and 10 billion to pay, yes.
Okay? Plus there is the Petroleum Corporation. Government has said it will not privatize, right? That will somehow turn this around. Now the history of reforming state-owned enterprises without thinking of some element of privatization is very difficult, okay? So we need to rethink some of that. We need to think about releasing public sector workers into the private sector. Right? So the donors do provide some programs, the development banks in particular, where you can, in a coordinated, logical way, release public sector workers with a proper package into the private sector. Right? And for instance, in many companies and even in some of the state agencies, there's a large number of electricians, mechanics, etc. Those people could find private sector jobs without any difficulty. So we need to think about that as well. So the expenditure side is, I think we can look at right-sizing expenditure. And I must say, Mr. Trump's policy of sort of taking the chainsaw on US government spending is not the way I would suggest it, but I think there is a point in that, is that the state has got very large and needs to be looked at very carefully. On the tax side, I think we need to do several things. We need to try to widen the tax net. So that there is a system of, and we need to improve the digitization of taxing, and that has to be done very effectively. So that's the Ramsys system has to be there. We need to also, I think, close in some of these tax holidays. There seem to be too long a tax holidays for too many sectors which are pleading for special privileges. And I think that time has gone. There was a time during the conflict that was justified, right? But I think now to have sectors talking about 25-year tax holidays for some investment purposes, I don't think that's sustainable, right? And then the last thing I think we've got to think about is really showing value for money in the use of tax revenue so that people have an incentive to pay, right? There are many examples which you and I face in daily life where you put in a form and then the public service thing is very, very slow. And you're wondering, why are you paying tax rupees for public services that are not global standards, right? So that public service delivery to a performance standard also becomes very important. That might encourage people to feel that they should contribute tax revenue to have this. So I think all of these elements becomes important. And I think we're going to have the private sector really being much more important. I don't think the state by itself anymore can do this. And on welfare, the truth is we've enjoyed an enormous welfare state of health and education being free at the point of entry. Sadly, we can no longer afford this. And we're going to have to think of some private insurance, which we all contribute to. We're going to have to be thinking of tuition fees in universities. These are all things that are going to have to come in the future. And so I think it's a different Sri Lanka in the future if we want to be prosperous.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganeshan, for your time here at Hyde Park. Indeed, enjoy the interview with you. And of course, the insights you've shared will definitely be helpful of Sri Lanka's development. And I hope our leaders hear this discussion to draw insights and to take a lead from where you have pointed us to. Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, former Director, Research at the ADB Institute in Tokyo, presently visiting fellow at the ODI Global, the largest think tank on development, economic development in the United Kingdom. He is the author of 15 books and co-authored a book on Sri Lanka from debt default to transformative development, where 27 proposals have been laid out through essays contributed by scholars and prominent personalities on Sri Lanka's economic crisis to development. So thank you very much, Dr. Ganeshan, once again for being here during your visit here in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park, and we'll bring you yet another topic to talk about. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.